as a reminder of who we are. We ground ourselves in these values of complexity for everyone. We know that all of our students are capable of handling complexity, and we know that students get smarter together, like all of us do. So that involves a lot of conversation and interaction, and that's a part of our work in the unit we're going to talk about today and in all of our work. And we know that students deserve authentic and meaningful work with texts. So there's going to be a lot of time in the texts, a lot of time talking about texts, a lot of time writing in response to texts and interacting with them in those ways. And there's not going to be really any time spent kind of in worksheet mode or going through exercises in that fashion. You may recall that we talked about Zaretta Hammond when we were together, and I bring this back up just to say that this is about producing effort-based, scaffolded arcs of work with massive amounts of discussion, writing, and reflection. That really is our goal and what we hope you'll see in our work. We also talked about the learning pit and how students can encounter challenge, and that can feel very daunting at first. That really lowers our affect. But our goal is to help students progress through that challenge and come out on the other side with a real boost in confidence in their ability to handle difficult tasks and difficult texts. So we know these will be challenging in a first encounter with them, and our expectation is that over time, students come to pretty solid understanding. We also talk about the cycle of our work. We begin with comprehension work with a text, where students get to do a first read of the text, annotate it, mark it up in the student reader. There's usually work around chunking and retelling if it's a longer text. Sometimes there's some different sort of open-ended comprehension questions that we work with. There's always going to be small and whole group discussion during that work, and that is actual comprehension work. It's not just testing students on comprehension, it's helping them go back through the text in a meaningful way. That goes into interpretation and analysis, which again focuses on small and whole group discussion. That's the thinking work of unpacking these ideas. And all of that work leads into and supports the genre-based writing that follows. In all of our materials, you're going to see this kind of whole collection. If you were to go into our resources on the website, you would find all of these things available, and you will likely use some tools from the digital toolkit to kind of amplify the work that is there. The digital toolkit here is going to largely take items that you're already going to encounter in the teacher manual and make them easily accessible and modifiable for you. So that should be helpful and should be relatively simple. You are more than welcome to take a look at the guidebooks and the assessment tools that are integrated in different places, and we hope that you get the chance to explore those. So at this point, we're going to shift over and I'm going to open up the unit and we'll be able to take a look at what that instruction will look like. Okay, as we look at this unit, my goal is to give you enough information and not any more information than you need during the video. So there's going to be, of course, a lot that's already in the teacher manual, and I don't want to repeat what you can already read there and make this video unnecessarily long. So what you see on the screen is the teacher manual for Foundations for Inquiry. You'll have a physical copy of that as well as the student reader. And the student reader, of course, contains the texts for the unit. Students are meant to interact with that, write all over it, take it to every conversation and discussion. And the teacher manual has, of course, all of the lessons in it that you would be using. In Foundations for Inquiry at every grade level, if you're using this unit, you would start with Part 2, which is Introduction to Text-Based Inquiry, and you'd be looking at this first cycle of work that starts with Session 7 and ends with the Writing Papers session. The first part of this is focused on independent reading, but that's the sort of beginning of the year setup section of work. So please take a look at it, but know that the sessions we would focus on for the pilot would be these ones at the beginning of Part 2. I encourage you to take a look at the introduction, look at the features of the books just to understand the different parts of them. There's also an introduction to Part 2 that's useful for framing the work that you would be doing with students. So, some things to know about. The sessions here will look very much like that cycle of work we displayed on the slide a moment ago. You'll see an introduction to the text. You'll see comprehension work happening with it. You'll see interpretive work happening in small and whole group discussions. And you will see writing work that builds from the discussions that students have just been having. That process happens about that same way across all grade levels. Some slight variations are present. So in 9th grade and in 12th grade, there's an additional small and whole class discussion. That question kind of leads into more interpretive work with the text. So there's a small and whole group discussion that then leads into the one that they will ultimately write about. There's also some work happening at 11th and 12th grade because the short stories for 11th and 12th grade are rather longer than others. The comprehension work includes some chunking work. So we see chunking the text at 12th grade. We see reordering and retelling at 11th grade, where students are kind of chunking it and unpacking the chronology of what's going on. But otherwise, you'll see that the large level work students are doing is very similar across the grade levels, and the texts are what increases in complexity. So as students go into this work, you will also want to know that we refer sometimes to like a literacy notebook, and that's just a place where students are taking notes as they write, doing quick writes, maybe drafting papers. That can be a physical notebook that students already use in the class. That can be a folder with loose leaf paper in it. That can be laptops that students are already used to working with in the classroom. There's nothing established about what that exactly has to be, so long as students can write in it regularly and can do both kind of casual and more formal writing in it. And it should be something that you can take a look at sometimes. So if students do a quick write, it should be something that you can see some of their responses in. So very quickly, talking about some of the work you would be doing in these sessions. As you introduce the text, we talk about it always as a whole class read aloud, as a teacher-led read aloud, so that all students can experience a clear first encounter with the text. There are situations where you might negotiate a different stretch of work with that. So maybe at this point in the year, it's appropriate for you to begin the reading with students and then hand it off to them where they complete it on their own. With the longer texts at 11th and 12th grade, maybe you split that reading across 2 class periods. Maybe they do more of it on their own. There are different ways to negotiate that. You'll see some of that discussed in the teaching note. But to put a focus on each lesson, really session 7 is about getting through the text with the class, getting through that first reading where students can annotate and think about it as that reading goes along, and then getting them into small groups to start unpacking it with the comprehension work. The session that follows wraps up the comprehension work, and with that, we're not expecting students to have absolute mastery of the text at this point. So they just encountered it the previous class period. They had time to work on it in small groups. And at the end of the comprehension work, there's usually a way that kind of is shared with the class, where they kind of bring it together and the teacher is charting some student responses with that. But students will build their comprehension of the text over the following sessions as well. So as they go back to do interpretive work, as they go back to do some of the discussion and the writing work, they're going to continue to understand more and more about the text. The comprehension work ends with a reflection about comprehension work. And I point this out because it's significant for the learning work that we're doing here. As students do this work, we stop sometimes to say, okay, notice what you were doing, notice what you were thinking about. How did we approach this question, and how did we ultimately go through the process of answering it? And then we can identify how we kind of tackled this complex text, how we can bring some of those tools into the next one as well. You see a similar reflection later with the interpretive work, and that's also used to kind of draw a distinction between here's what we do when we're talking about, comprehending a text, which often involves like retelling it, and here's what we do when we're interpreting a text, which means we're kind of bringing our own ideas to it and we're putting things together in different ways with the text. The comprehension work leads into the interpretive work. Like I said, 9th and 12th grade have a couple of additional discussions happening in them. But really the focus there is about pushing students into productive small group discussion, whole group discussion, unpacking the question. And that's meant to be thinking work. It's not, go to your small group and share your perfectly composed answer that you already thought of. It's meant to be a little bit of that messy, iterative work where students are sort of building on ideas, coming up with answers that are maybe like a little stronger than they were before, or going back to find more evidence to support it. And while they're working in small groups, the teacher would be going around to see how those conversations are going, to kind of push conversations a little bit, and see if there are any misconceptions that are like widespread that deserve some attention as a whole class. Then students move into whole class discussion. And as students move into whole class discussion, there's an opportunity for students to quick write their thoughts in advance of that whole class discussion. So it can be intimidating sometimes to talk as a whole class. Really, it helps to give students that time to think through their ideas, to get some thoughts on paper in a pretty informal way. Ultimately, this can kind of be a draft of the paper they're about to write, but it doesn't even have to have that structure to it. It's really just get your thoughts on paper, continue thinking a little bit as we go into the discussion. And that way everybody has something they can kind of fall back on if they feel like they're just drawing a blank in conversation. You'll find sentence stems and some other tools along the way for positive discussions in the classroom. And you'll find that we set aside a good chunk of time for discussion. And, you know, we're really kind of embracing the messiness of discussion, which can involve sometimes silences and moments where students are really trying to clarify what they say. Moments where students really just need to look back at the text and think about, you know, what else did I mark? What else do I have to say about this topic? And it ultimately leads into this reflection. They get to capture ideas from the discussion and then think about, well, what was helpful? What did I do to form an interpretation? How can I do this work in the future? That leads into the writing work. You'll see an intersession as students get ready to do the writing work. And it says articulating the qualities of interpretive writing. You're welcome to take a look at that. If that fits in your cycle of work and you want to dive into it, by all means go for it. But it's really about sort of extracting from students, well, what do we already know about this kind of writing? And how can we kind of group those ideas in ways that are ultimately going to be similar to the rubric we're looking at? If we look at a good example, do we get any more ideas about this kind of writing? So that's what the intersession is, if you choose to do it. Like I said, it is optional. And then it moves into the writing work. And you'll notice that there's not a bunch of sessions of writing instruction in advance of the writing work. It's really, okay, we've just had these discussions. We've just been in the text this whole time. Let's get that thinking on paper and argue for our interpretation of what's going on in this text. And again, that's deliberate because the writing work that students do with this gets built on later in the unit. So the papers they produce in response to this show us where they're at in their writing right now. And they also give us a set of tools that we can come back to with a second writing task that would be in the second half of the unit and say, okay, here were some examples from the first half of the unit. We're going to take a look at how we approach the claims in our writing, for example. Or we're going to take a look at how some different students used and incorporated evidence in their writing to see if that supports us as we go into writing this next paper. So kind of like that comprehension work and that first interpretation, these first papers aren't expected to be absolutely perfect. They're expected to be insightful, and they're supposed to, like get students into this interpretive work and take a first crack at it. And they are the really kind of like the seed for the work that happens later in the unit with the writing work as well. And we continue to build on that over the year. Speaking of writing resources, I want to point out the tools that are available in the Digital Resource Hub. You can find targeted writing lessons there, which are wonderful to explore. In this case, you would look at the interpretive argument sessions if you wanted to book around for ones that would be useful. You'll also find at every grade level, there are digital tools that align with the unit. So if you go into Foundations for Inquiry, you'll pull up and you'll see like copies of the writing tasks, copies of charts for discussion, some different graphic organizers and forms. For example, if you just wanted everybody in the class to have like criteria for a good discussion, that could be pushed out in Google Docs, or you could print that out for everyone and just say, okay, we all need to have a copy of this, and we can refer to it from time to time. So these are all useful tools to come back to in addition to all of the writing tools that we shared. So those are the tools to navigate. It's the teacher manual, the student reader, and you can pull anything that you need from the digital toolkit as well. We expect it'll be a little bit of a challenge, and sometimes it's a shift for the classroom because the way this kind of works is really getting students right into the text, and then there's a lot of discussion and small group work. So for some classes, that may be what you do already. For some, that may be a shift. And if it's a shift, just know that like those shifts happen usually gradually over time. It's something that we build with students and build in the classroom over time. And it can be something that either takes off surprisingly well or just starts off as a challenge, and just be ready for either of those. We're really excited about this work. We hope that you find it really engaging and that you are just really surprised at the strength of your students' responses with this. Thank you very much.